After witnessing Hurricane Beryl break multiple records, some of which were held for 70 years, we decided to make a series strictly for hurricanes, and this will be the P3R on hurricanes, and that is prepare, recognize, respond, recover. This will be the first episode, prepare. Whenever we think about disaster preparedness and preparing for disasters, we have to keep in mind the rule of three. 3 hours without shelter, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. This is a guideline. These are not rules to follow. This is a guideline. So you should have shelter within 3 hours. You should have water within 3 days, and you should have food within 3 weeks. When we talk about preparing for disasters, obviously that's going to include shelter. Shelter is categorized as anything that separates you from the natural environment. Shelter for a lot of us can just be a jacket on a windy day, a windbreaker, right? That can be categorized as shelter. A heat blanket, if your body's dropping temperature, right? That is classified as shelter because we're separating ourselves from the ambient or natural environment. Now, obviously having shelter during a hurricane or tropical storm would be better off in a dense building, a brick building, something that's very sturdy. But we can also have shelter in a vehicle, right? Just anything that separates you from the natural ambient environment. And the more separation you have from that, the better and the more reliable that shelter often is. Food. So when it comes to food, we're thinking about food that is ready to eat. Canned food, canned soups, Chef Boyardee, little Mylar packets of tuna, Mylar packets of chicken. Meal replacement bars are fantastic, right? They just weigh a few ounces and they can have as many as 1,200 calories in a single bar. Water. So when we talk about water, we recommend at least 2 gallons of water per person per day, preferably 3, but at least 2 gallons of water per person per day. The gallon of water per person per day is what your body normally needs, right? So we're gonna be drinking a gallon of water no matter what. But having a little bit of extra water just to clean ourselves, hygiene, right? We have to keep clean, and water helps us keep clean. Remember that staphylococcus, right? So on the creases in our body, our groin, behind our knees, our armpits, all these different things, it grows there, right? So if we get a minor cut, something like that, that could turn to staph, it could turn to gangrene, right? Medical is a huge thing when we're talking about natural disasters. And also keep in mind, having a water filter is not going to answer all of your water woes because a lot of that water has chemicals in it. They cannot filter out these extremely harsh chemicals that sits in this water. You can use water bricks. They hold just a couple gallons of water. You can easily pick them up. You can store them away underneath your couch, whatever the case is. You can put them in the back of your vehicle. But having some type of container that holds that water that you can easily pick up, carry around, put in your vehicle, you can maneuver with it, that is vital. We have to have a way to not only store our water, but a way to transport that water. Medical. So when we think about medical, let's think about the March algorithm. We have massive hemorrhaging. This is massive bleeding. We have airway. We have respiration. We have circulation. Then we have head injury and hyperthermia. Massive hemorrhaging, this would be things like tourniquets, right? Packing gauze, Z-fold gauze, hemostats, right? So quick clot, C-locks, bleed stop, all these things, right? Those are strictly for bleeding. Airway. So airway would be something like your nasopharyngeal airway, which literally opens up a patient's airway if they're unconscious, and it allows them to breathe. Respiratory, knowing how to correctly render CPR, when to render CPR, when to stop rendering CPR, and the different types of CPR per infant, young child, and adult. Circulation, and we have H for head injuries and also hyperthermia. So head injuries, as you can imagine, you would have bandages, right? So for hyperthermia, you can have something like a heat blanket to keep that casualty warm. And as you can imagine, with circulation, addressing massive hemorrhaging will help. Addressing airway will help. Providing CPR will help. And using a heat blanket will also help with that circulation as we have to keep the body warm. It's also a good idea to pack a casualty card in your kit. A casualty card allows you to record what medical aid was rendered. That way, once that patient gets transported to a more permanent solution, they can look at that card and see exactly what was done. Or if there's someone who's more skilled, once they get on scene, you can provide them that card and they can see exactly what was done with that patient and what exactly they need to do. In addition to your March algorithm, you should have basic wound care, right? So we're talking about 1x3 bandages, butterfly bandages, insect bites, burn cream, all of these basic yet all-encompassing ways to address multiple medical emergencies. Face masks. You should have a face mask in your medical kit. So wherever you have mass amounts of flooding, you have mold and you also have black mold. After Hurricane Katrina, response teams and civilians were getting fungal infections in their lungs from the mold, standard mold and also black mold, causing all types of respiratory issues. So we have to have a mask that can separate us from that mold and filter out those spores. Forms of communication. Obviously, this can be a cell phone, this can be a ham radio, this can be a GMRS radio, multiple forms of communication. And even if we cannot directly communicate because the cell towers are down, our radios got wet, whatever the case is, Even if you cannot directly communicate, you need to have an SOP, a standard operating procedure, to know what to do in these situations, to know what to do in these events. Routes. You should have multiple routes. You should have multiple routes that you can go to, that you can rely on. Think of the primary alternate contingency emergency, right? PACE, primary alternate contingency emergency. You should have multiple routes that you can take if you need to leave. A lot of the people during Hurricane Katrina had less than 24 hours to respond. And you can imagine if we're all going in one area, we're going to be stuck there, right? So you need to have multiple routes that you can rely on, where if it's not as congested, you can get out. Intel, you need to have a way to have access to intel, whether it's just like a hand crank radio or you have a ham radio tuned to the National Weather Service, the NWS, whatever the case is. But you need to have a way to have intel to know what's going on, because intel helps us make informed decisions. There's a reason behind that decision. Gear. So when we think about gear, the very basics, the 5 C's of survival, right? Cutting. Cutting is a knife, right? You can do many things with a knife. Cover, right? So cover would be a poncho that you can turn into a shelter if it's a tarp, whatever the case is. Container. Containers are for carrying water, right? It helps us transport things. Cordage, right? Cordage is paracord, 550 cord, survivor cord, Titan cord. There's many types of cordage, but to have some kind of cordage we can use for knotting, preparing gear. You can also use a cord to make a triangular bandage if you really need to. Combustion. This includes matches. There are stormproof matches, waterproof, windproof matches, right? Lighters. There's many different sources, ferro rods, right? Whatever you want to use, but some way to make fire. In addition to those things, we also want to have things like flashlights, solar power chargers, batteries, right? All these different things, water purifiers, just different pieces of gear that we can use that will directly help us and directly support us. This video is a very brief overview of what you can do to prepare for any type of natural disaster, but especially hurricanes. Now stay tuned, give us a follow for episode 2, where we talk about how to recognize hurricanes. For more information on natural disasters and overall self-sufficiency, check out our Patreon at the link below. Thank you all so much for your support. God bless, stay safe, and remember always, stay sanctified.